but we will go ahead and get started. So, thanks for joining us today. The folks that we have to chat with today. So, you have myself. I will probably do the least amount of talking as possible because we'll have the smart people do that. My name is Alex Tietze. I'm the VP of Sales here at Blue Team Alpha. Today, I'm joined by Joe. So, Joe is our founder and CEO. We also have Dan Wolford here, CISO and VP of Innovation. And then we have Ryan. Ryan's our VP of Services. So the stuff that we'll cover today, we'll go through containerized networks, what that means, vulnerability management, email security, data loss prevention, and then we'll talk about budget, and then we'll hopefully leave enough time for some Q&A. So let's chat about containerized networks. First and foremost, what the heck does that mean? Because when I think of containers, I think of like the container store, and that cannot be what that actually is. So, Ryan, what are we thinking here?
Well, absolutely. Just to sort of get away from the idea on containerized networks and moving into the concept of containerized applications, one thing that has come around recently, has been pretty popular in large-scale services, is to containerize your software, as well as incorporate containerization wherever possible. And these are technologies like Kubernetes and Docker and things of that in that idea. So the thing that is a security advantage here has to do with the idea that when you put a container out there, if they're built correctly, the intention there is that they're immutable. And what that means from an attacker's perspective is that if you are trying to attack a container, unless you have an additional exploit, your attack when you get on to that machine is not only limited in its scope and its ability to do what it does, because most container services limit what a container is allowed to do when an application is put inside one. But it also creates a scenario that if a difference is detected in that container, it is quite often automatically shut down and restarted and put into a state that it was previously. And so when you put these things into your networks, it creates a bit of another layer of security that creates a bit of a fail-safe. Now, these are also pretty good if you were to, they do scale pretty well, but as I think Dan might have some perspectives on here, if they are locked down too much, they might have issues scaling as well. One other thing I wanted to mention before I sort of give the floor open to see if anyone wants to banter back and forth across this idea or wants to ask me or prod me a little bit further, has to do around the idea that the containers themselves, if they are not set, they take a little bit of extra massaging, and it usually requires an engineer's understanding or getting a container from the software provider themselves if they're a third-party vendor. So yeah, I mean, they're just really nice because if there is a vulnerability associated with them, often it severely limits their impact if an attacker is attacking it. And since these things are mostly to service the public side of the network, it does create an additional layer of security.
Yeah, right. You're right. It's a trade-off. You know, we just saw this recently. If you follow any Bitcoin news, Coinbase, one of the biggest exchanges in the world, went offline, and they weren't allowing people to do any trades. And I know from some inside knowledge, I know the people at the security team there, like Philip, a lot of their software is containerized, and it's good for security. It's like you said, it's a trade-off. So they have some of the best security, where all of their things that are in production, things that they deploy are containers. So the security is very tight. But then you see the problem if there's a huge surge in requests from the customer side, they can't scale as fast as if they were to have a little bit less security, but then we're able to scale faster because of that trade-off. But you know, for organizations that need a lot of control over the supply chain, containers are great. You know, then you can control like what the dependencies are. I remember whenever containers first became popular, like Docker, it was very cool to download some program in a container because it had all of the dependencies already built into it.
Yep.
So then we can just
Absolutely.
scan the image, that Docker just comes as an image. You scan that, like, okay, this is secure in its current packaging, and then go and deploy and run it. So there are things that I like about containers. I would never, tell somebody not to investigate to see if it's right for their environment. But it's always good for us at Blue Team Alpha to be aware if there are containers in the environment, because that is an additional type of vulnerability that we have to check for.
How common are these? Like is it hard to build? I mean, do most people just like stay away from it because of the challenges, or?
Well, I think that there's been a big push. They do work over content delivery networks pretty well. So in some of the major software companies, as long as they're put together well, they do scale with demand pretty easily. They tend to work. They're most popular on the popular cloud provider platforms like Amazon and Azure and things of that nature. And a large number of third-party vendors provide containers, especially for their popular applications. If you were like trying to do it with databases and things like that, it'd be a lot more difficult just due to the nature of database. But there's a lot of different ways that you might have to approach it. If you are developing software in your organization, it's definitely something you should look into, I would say, because it allows you to provide a level of security that often comes as a challenge for engineers, or like as an IT provider providing security to engineering laptops. They have a lot of exceptions that have to be made. Typically, you typically have to allow an engineer to have local administrator rights. You often have to allow the engineer the ability to engage with business critical infrastructure that's servicing your your company's revenue just from the application itself. And if you are able to set these up correctly, it allows a chain of custody and an approval process to the code. That means that a low-level developer isn't going to necessarily wreck your server, because it can go through a specific pipeline, go through debugging tests, make sure that it works before it goes into production. And these things can be enforced. And, you have a much, how would you say that? Least privileged use, but
yes,
more of it.
you made a good point about limiting the impact. That's another cool thing that I like about containers, because if something breaks in a container, it doesn't ruin the entire environment, and it can be redeployed really easy.
By default, they typically redeploy or restart immediately and start yelling at you, from the monitoring interface. So
a lot of
these are very. What's the difference really between, the major difference between like a VM? Like virtualization's been around.
Oh, that's a great question.
A long time, right? So when you think of like virtualization and microsegmentation, even in virtualized networks, like what's the major difference there, and what's the major benefit to going containers over a VM?
That's actually a great question. And it really allows me to I'm serious. It really allows me to talk to the side of containers that like one of the first questions that's typically asked, especially by an engineer if they haven't heard of it before, is what's the difference between that and a VM? The way that containers are built in a virtual machine, the container exists, the security container. When we say container, we're referencing an imaginary boundary that prevents that machine from interacting outside that boundary, except for ways that we've put holes in to allow it to receive information, send information out, and vice versa. A virtual machine is an entire computer that has its boundary set at that level. Whereas containerization and containers like Docker and Kubernetes, they are focused on the application itself. So the container is shrunk down inside the computer and exists as a very small application that, as long as the other machines are running the same software is easy to deploy across sort of like in a peer-to-peer network kind of way as necessary. But again, these containers also, so, you know, the boundary exists there, but the other aspect here is that what's it called? The features of the operating system that are allowed access by that small program are much more limited.
Sure.
And they often exist in a way that is actively trying to prevent the containerized software from interacting with the rest of the machine in an unsafe way.
Yeah.
So basically,
hardware.
yeah, it's just got a shrunk down footprint. It's not running a full operating system and everything else, right?
That's right.
It's like running the app.
It's running the minimum amount of components necessary in order to execute the service.
Right, which would then shrink your footprint, I mean, substantially, right? Even I'm, just thinking about, I know it's a topic for later, right? But, operating system costs, you have vulnerability management. If you have a bunch of VMs, you've got to do vuln management on every single VM.
Yes.
All of the aspects of
and the OS
of that VM. So it exponentially explodes your vulnerability management program too. So so I mean, there's a big benefit there.
They're more expensive also. So for budget.
Right. Well, and a full VM would use a lot more resources, it sounds like, for ancillary things, not having to do with the production of what you actually wanted.
Getting charged CPU costs for, the system idle process that's running some background checker or file cacher. I would caution one area that I would say, just being myself with a background of engineering and software development, I don't want to put too much on my fellow, engineers there on that side of the house. There are some situations where containers are not the best use case. And there are some situations where the process that you're trying to make into a container needs to undergo a bigger transformation. Mostly it has to do with data paths and them being shaped instead of like a single line, having like a Christmas tree parallel processing. And so there is often in the software development process some changes that need to be made if you are building your own custom software there. There's a lot of guides online. Most engineers can get up to date with it. But like I said, it's a super cool idea. It works really well. It is pretty secure, but one size does not fit all. That's definitely
when you're going from VM to VM, right? You can encrypt the traffic between them, right? Because they're full OS.
Yes.
So you can encrypt the network traffic from one VM to another VM. Can you do the same thing in a container, from one container to another container? Can you encrypt the traffic? The data?
Yes, you absolutely can. And in fact, that is one of the things that you might consider a con, is that there is the possibility, if the containerization is not deployed correctly or built properly, of creating sort of listening areas or vulnerable areas of the application, because it might be split between multiple containers. That data path in the original program wasn't thinking that it was going over a network. And so this data might be critical data, that might be sensitive data, that if an attacker were able to listen to, might be bad. So there are encryption algorithms that for the message passing services, but you just need to make sure you utilize them.
One last thing about containerized systems is that they're typically stateless. So if you need stateful persistent storage, containers are usually not the best choice. A VM, in that case, with a virtual hard drive, we lean more towards VM in that case, if you need that stateful persistent storage. But if you just need a stateless app, container, cheaper, faster, in some cases more secure.
Absolutely. My challenge would be talk to your engineering department if it's your own software and you're interested in learning more about this, because it's most likely they're familiar with it.
Yeah. So when you guys were touching on vulnerability management earlier, because I mean, I imagine each container would, I guess, be an asset, but um, this topic specifically seems like it gets misrepresented in our industry a lot. So I'm curious for the beginning part of this of like, just define vulnerability management, like what it actually should look like, because I don't think it's usually done a lot of justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest misconception that people have is that just by like patching things that they're doing vulnerability management. You know, like, oh well, you know, it's Patch Tuesday and we deploy all the patches in series, you know,
Patch management, right?
and so we patched everything, so you know we don't have any vulnerabilities. But really true vulnerability management, patching is a piece of it, but there's also the configuration side as well, right? There's misconfigurations that can happen. There can be old insecure services that are used, still used, in the applications, or just are simply turned on that have no business being turned on, that are vulnerable. And so vulnerability management is a more holistic approach. You'll hear from a lot of managed service providers. They'll say, "Oh yeah, well we do vulnerability management as a part of your monthly service, blah blah blah, whatever." But in reality, what they're really talking about is patch management. Unless they're holding change control meetings with you and trying to determine if they can turn services off that don't need to be on, or they're talking about configurations that are either misconfigured or just simply extra or unneeded. They're really not doing vulnerability management for you. They're doing most likely patch management. So that's I think the biggest area of misconception around vulnerability and asset management. And the other thing that the asset management piece is almost generally completely missed. Like you ask a company how they manage their assets, and they'll be like, "Well, I have this Excel document over here that the help desk people and the provisioning people all put their information into." But that's really not asset management. Asset management is far more proactive than just having some kind of a spreadsheet that you're adding computer names and IP addresses onto. Asset management is kind of a living, breathing thing. Devices can be added to the network or into the system that sometimes the administrators don't exactly know are even there. So it's really got to be more proactive. There are tools out there and things that can help gather what assets are available and on the network, and even help classify them. Shocker, attackers use this too. When they're doing recon, they're going to do some very similar scans to just try to figure out what is on the network in the first place and what kind of devices it is. The internal administrators that put these devices on the network have the added advantage of context as to what these things are. So that makes that a lot easier for the administrators, but it does still take
turnover
some work. So
I saw a problem.
I'll just kind of leave it there. That's like the two basic misconceptions and mishandling of vulnerability and asset management.
Yeah, I saw issues with turnover, like the IT department would have turnover on staff, and however assets were being managed before, however vulnerabilities were managed before, it gets forgotten. Because this is continuous. It's not a checkbox. You can't just do vulnerability management one time. Do the asset once a year because it changes throughout the year, even daily.
It was on my bucket list. I did it last year. It was cool.
So like being compliant with things makes it feel like it is a once a year. Like let's just do all of our vulnerabilities quarterly. Let's do our asset management every other month. But in reality, it's constant, right? And this is where automation comes in really strong. Is if you have a solution that's continuous 24/7, always scanning for vulnerabilities automatically, and then now you're just managing the notifications. Like, hey, our automated system found something. Let's go and investigate. or the asset management, something pops up that says, oh, there's a new device. Let's go investigate. What is it? That's really hard when you look at these networks like a university that has thousands of students bringing their devices. They pretty much ignore the people that I've talked to. They have to ignore alerts like that. It's just noise. So, the trick is taking all of those alerts from vulnerability management, asset management, the automation. You try to reduce the noise, and that way you can focus on things that could actually be malicious.
Yeah, I'd also say with turnover too, like how many people, just if you're, joining us today, just think about situations where you've had somebody that had a particular skill set. Say they were really good at a particular kind of firewall or network or server OS or you name it, application, right? And then that person leaves, right? They've been maintaining it. They know how to handle the vulnerabilities. They know how to check for vulnerabilities, right? And then that person leaves and the person either doesn't get replaced or they get replaced with somebody that has a slightly different skill set. Maybe they don't like Palo Alto network firewalls. Maybe they like Cisco Meraki's. I don't know.
Want to do it.
I'm just saying, like as an example, right? And now you have all these devices out there that aren't really getting paid attention to, or not being paid attention to in the right way, if they're even getting scanned for vulnerabilities in the first place, right? So I mean, with turnover, you can and likely the new engineers answer is, oh, well, that's just something that the last guy put in, and I don't really like it, and I don't really want to deal with it, so I'm not gonna, like more often than not, that's people kind of gravitate to the things that they know. So a lot of times, even if you do pay attention and have a vulnerability list, those are like the last ones that are going to get done.
How often have you guys gone into an environment and scanned the network and you found devices that the customer didn't even know was there, like IoT?
That's like every incident I've ever been on. I mean,
every network.
Everyone. Devices, shoot. I found entire networks, like one incident, like they didn't even give me a full list of sites. It's like that you're always finding stuff that they don't even know they have.
IPv6 and also, devices that are
IPv6,
but we're not using IPv6, we have it disabled, but those ports are still open and listening.
Right.
Yeah, it's true. If you can find a way to route it to the device. One thing too that I've noticed as well that seems to be a trend, and maybe it has to do with just the amount of expectations that are coming for some IT folk is I've definitely had people, I wouldn't say argue with me, but they say, oh, I'm okay. I keep my vulnerability management up to date on my external facing devices. And what I think that a lot of people don't realize is how an attacker attacks the inside of their network first. And everyone's like, oh, it's phishing, it's this, it's that. Yes, there's an aspect to that that's true. But there's also web-based exploits that are looking for extensions installed by default programs that the user might have, or that IT personnel might have put on the machine. And if those aren't up to date, then you can end up in a position where now the attacker knows that you have an out-of-date PDF browser, and they send you a malicious PDF that opens up in that way that takes the thing out, or whether it be Microsoft Word or a number of other applications, even things as simple as text viewers, things like Notepad++ or even 7-zip decryptors. These things have had known exploits, and all you need to do is get someone to open a bad file with the right file extension and hope that it's the default. And it may not happen every time for you, but it happens for a certain percentage of people who are getting attacked in this way. So especially if they were to have something like a 0-day, that's definitely and sometimes you can even convince users to install a piece of software in order to view your thing that would be vulnerable in the first place. So I guess I've just seen that more often than I'm comfortable with. People who have their external devices.
You just reminded me of something that I saw it firsthand when I was in Asia. There were companies who would download the patches and reverse engineer it to try to exploit whatever it was that was patched, and they knew they had a window and create a weaponized exploit for something that had just been patched. So it's not a 0 day, it's like a 1 day or a 2 day. But I saw entire companies with staff, that was the whole job. Download a patch, reverse engineer it, weaponize it, and then sell it to God knows who, potentially our enemy.
Yeah. Did you guys, I don't know if you guys saw the Lockbit takedown. Did you guys see or read the response from the creator of Lockbit? He basically said, yeah, they took down all of my stuff, but it's fine because I had, how they basically, he was claiming that how they got in was a vulnerability on from PHP.
Yeah.
That had been installed on some of his web servers. So it kind of made me chuckle. I was like, oh, well, yeah, that's nice to see. It's nice to see Lockbit and the threat actors are also having an issue with vulnerability management. Like it happened to him. So it makes sense because for anybody who's been a CISO or a director of IT or a manager of IT or just simply someone that is in charge of the budget for an IT or a cyber department, it's pretty difficult to go to your CFO and be like, hey, so here's the thing. I need like 1 to 2 people to just run around and patch everything we have all the time. Right? Like it's a really, really tough ask because it's hard to determine a return on investment, right? But what I have seen is like they're okay with it if you can give, like, if it's more of a, it's going to cost us X amount a month or something like that, like where you're not having to invest in people and all that kind of stuff. It's more of like you outsource it or, get some tooling, some really good tooling to try to help and manage and decrease it. But usually, there's still people that have to run the tools. So this is one of those, I would say, challenge areas in our industry as a whole, because we all know that we need to do, if you're on this call, the likelihood that you need to do vulnerability management is very high. But it's a difficult one to have a conversation with, like a CFO or somebody that says, okay, well, what am I going to get for this money? It's a difficult one to have a conversation around when they're only looking for ROI.
Yeah. So and we'll keep rolling, but you guys mentioned, actually it's a perfect segue. Thanks for setting it up. But you guys talked about email as a vulnerability. And so I guess I'm curious there, is that like an entire program of like how to set up email security? Is that just a subset of like a vulnerability management program? Like, walk me through that one.
Well, first of all, email is the worst. And I would strongly recommend that all companies avoid using it if possible, as much as possible. If you have something like Teams or Slack or even Discord, anything besides email is going to be more secure. Security was never intended, email was never created with security in mind. Back then, back in the early like 50s and 60s, they didn't even want passwords on systems. They fought IBM, like the original MIT hackers would fight MIT or fight IBM for putting passwords on machines. They created email back in the days when all of this was free between universities and government. Security was not something they were concerned about. Nowadays, when we talk about all of the things that we've tried to add for security, like SPF, like DKIM and DMARC, this is all stuff that we're trying to bolt on to try to verify who is sending me this email, because we're getting a lot of spoofing. This is still the most common attack vector where the vulnerability is us. It's the human element, and the attacker knows that. So they're going to send an email to employees of the company trying to pretend like they are a coworker, or they're the CEO, or they're one of the IT provider. They're a member of the IT department.
I like to pretend to be a job applicant.
Yeah, tricking HR by sending them a PDF of your resume, but it's actually a weaponized PDF to gain access. So, oh,
Maybe even better in a Word doc.
I would love it if everybody could stop using email. I know that's not in reality possible. We're still going to have email during, maybe forever. We're going to be stuck with email, but
Dan,
still,
the world needs dreamers like you, buddy.
I'm still going to open every time get a chance to talk about email security. I'm always going to open with that and say it's not secure. And there is no silver bullet. There's no perfect security for email other than just not using it.
Well, when you look at, oh, go ahead, Joe.
I was just gonna say, I mean, if, like you said, it wasn't built with security in mind. Anyone can send anything to an email address. It's completely open, right? There's no, acceptance on the other side. Like, do you want this? Yes or no? It's like, no, it's just coming into your inbox now. Thank you. Have a good day. It's just very, and it's designed to be that way. And yeah, you can try to close it off by only accepting email from contacts and some other things, but that's almost no one does that. If you look at the messaging applications, you generally speaking have to be invited, right? You have to be invited. There's kind of a two-way, there's an authorization process of some sort that happens in order to initiate a conversation. So
Text only, I would say if you have to use email at all, use text only. We see a lot of exploits happening through HTML because embedded links or iframes or like hidden pixels with pictures with tracking pixels. If you can switch your email to text only, you kind of eliminate that whole class of threats.
You mentioned DKIM and SPF earlier. I mean, if you guys are the professional attackers, like how effective are those technologies?
It can be effective if it's configured correctly, but a lot of times when we scan a domain looking for vulnerabilities to spoofing, it's not configured correctly. So, it doesn't help.
I've never personally ran into a lot of trouble getting any phishing emails delivered. Like I've never ran into a lot of trouble on it. I think that there's a lot of security features out there the intent is to filter email of malicious file types. And yeah, that works in a certain way, but there's a lot of different ways to approach file types that are getting delivered as attachments. And in some cases, it's quite easy to mask the whole thing by maybe sending an encrypted zip file. There's no way, especially when you start using encryption, when the attackers are using encryption, it provides a layer of security for the attacker to deliver the mail quite often. It's hard for a lot of different, email security filters to be able to look into that in a deep inspection perspective. And every network is different enough that, like I said, I've never ran into too much trouble. I've had to mess with emails, in any of the times that I'm trying to send phishing emails, I might have had to mess with them, might have to find ways to bypass. But if I can if there's a way for outsiders to send attachments to people and, I have something in mind that I'm trying to get out there, I've never been completely unsuccessful. I'll put it that way. So although there are other security features out there that exist, they're not, I wouldn't say that there's any out there that really, make me feel like, oh, okay, there's no way I can do phishing here. Because again, we can talk all day long that it comes down to the human factor and training, and I can get people to go around filters for me sometimes.
I like what you said about encryption. It's a double-edged sword because when you do full encryption, it's great for security and confidentiality, but then it's bad for any of your security systems that try to do like deep packet inspection or message content inspection. Now there's no visibility unless you're breaking the encryption. So that's
I would rephrase that as it's great for privacy and confidentiality. It's terrible for security.
Yeah,
it's funny. I had at one point I had a dual role. It was chief security officer and chief privacy officer, and I always used to tell my boss, I was like, look, these two hats conflict naturally. right? Like the privacy officer in me wants everything to remain private and confidential. The security officer in me wants access to see everything, right? And it's like it's a natural conflict, that between those two roles. And email, I feel like email is kind of like stuck in that conundrum of being open and trying to maintain confidentiality, but at the same time it's so open that you really can't allow for it to be completely open without any security controls. But I mean, what are there some security controls that should be implemented that maybe you see aren't normally?
Yeah, the biggest one that everyone can do, even us, it's all about education and awareness. That is the most important control for email security. It's not technical, it's more administrative, providing training and awareness. But every human being that is receiving and sending email is a sensor. And that everyone has their own level of awareness about if this email is good or fishy or weird. And it's hard to teach people what is weird, but I'll give you an example. This company that I was working at, one of the executives got an email from a .gov, which you might think has better security than most. But that user who got the email, it just felt off. It felt weird. So they sent it to the security team, sent it to us. I was the head of security and said, I don't know, there's something weird about this email. I wasn't expecting it. So our recommendation was to contact the person using a different channel, message them, call them, text, send a message on LinkedIn, but use a second communication channel. And then they did. And we found out that .gov had been compromised that morning. And it was only because the person that received it had the right level of security, education, awareness, and training to know
vigilance.
And that's a control that I would say is number one for email security. As long as you're doing that, and that's like basic thing that every company should do.
Love it. Well, I guess easiest way is just get rid of email. Though then I'm gonna have a hard time tracking down prospects. So little tough there. So we're moving on to DLP here because this I feel like, and Dan, Ryan, Joe, I feel like you all have schooled me enough that there isn't a perfect system out here for data loss prevention. Well, why is that? Like, what's wrong with it? Why can't we do it?
I think that there's a couple of factors that make the data loss prevention a difficult challenge. This really was not something considered with the basic operating systems when they were first developed, meaning that there's a lot of different types of files where log trails and audit trails are hard to follow. But on top of that, there tends to be tens of thousands of files, and tracking where they go, understanding which ones are potential threats almost always comes down to a data science approach and looking for anomalies of who's touching a file and who shouldn't be touching a file. And then once a file is sent via email or Slack to some external party, then you've lost complete control over it with most networks. I actually, there's not too many data loss prevention solutions I can think of that ensures that you have to decrypt the file individually every time once it's outside the network. On top of that, humans find lots of ways to work around data loss prevention. And it's somewhat controversial in some cases, depending on how it's perceived and understood by the people in the company. It can very easily start to look like, oh, well, you're tracking everything I'm doing and whatnot, which depending on the company might be quite difficult to deal with. So yeah, I mean, data loss prevention is a hard problem for a variety of different reasons, I would say. And unless, I don't think there's a magic bullet solution that addresses them all equally well in a way where there wouldn't be some workaround or mitigation to, some untracked file that you've pushed all these files into and now you're sending out across the network. So yeah, that would be my first my first thought there.
Yeah, I think kind of like vulnerability management, this is kind of one of those things where it's like, yeah, it's hard, and hard things, hard things generally get put to the back of the list, like every list, all lists, right? So DLP, while there are, I think, several ways that you can go about identifying data loss and doing your best to prevent it. Like you said, I don't know of any silver bullet. There are some vendors out there that have some really good solutions around this. But at the end of the day, it's probably not going to be one particular thing. You look at, well, we can set rate limits on our firewall to set alarms if too much goes out from one source or something like that. But of course, the threat actors are going to throttle that. They throttle how much they're taking out at one time from one place. So there's ways around that too. You can block certain cloud providers that host like Dropbox, right? That host file solutions, where the other end, block those on the firewall. You can do some things like that if you know that your organization doesn't use them. But a lot of times, that comes back to bite you when sales or marketing needs X, Y, or Z presentation from said thing immediately, right? Yep. You're welcome, Alex. Yes, I'm completely blaming sales and marketing.
It's fair. It's warranted.
Right. And so I think there are a lot of different ways to kind of skin that cat, but it's but none of them are a silver bullet, and it really takes an effort to understand where the data is. And then of course they're trying to find what's really important, right? In this, when you're talking about data loss prevention, find the stuff that's really important and really put the controls around that stuff. Like, don't try to do data loss prevention across everything on your entire network that's ever existed, ever, right? That's not going to be feasible, but you can put controls around the very specific areas where this critical data is, and then on top of that, try to use encryption to the best of your abilities to be able to say, if the data did get out, that even though it left the building, it is, it may still be encrypted. So trying to encrypt things at rest, or being able to just generally use encryption so that even if it gets out, it becomes difficult for the attacker to use on the other side, or they have to execute multiple attacks to be able to get to that data.
Yep, certainly. Documentation
be my number one.
Was that?
Before my VPN died and I had to reset, I was gonna say encryption. It would be my number one recommendation for some type of data loss prevention. Like you said, there is no perfect solution, but encryption is really good because you can encrypt things at rest on disk. You can do full disk encryption. You can also select the option to encrypt your cloud storage. So like all of these cloud providers usually have an option where you can do encryption in transit and at rest. That is going to help, if you can't access the data without the decryption keys. So, if the attacker, like we've seen it a lot in our incident management team, where we go to respond to an incident, almost every time it's a ransomware attack, it actually started with data theft. And we see a lot of data that's not encrypted that gets stolen and now gets used as a part of that extortion that, we're going to leak your data, we're going to sell your data. That's a big part of modern attacks that we're seeing is very common right now.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things to comment on here. I think we said a lot of, like, how are you going to do this? Can't solve this problem. It's a really difficult problem. It doesn't mean that it's not worth taking an approach. And it all starts with, I guess you would say intellectual property review, right? You want to know what parts of your network, what parts of your data, where your file stores are the most important and critical to your business. And then trying to enforce principles of least privilege, right? The people who have access to that, the more critical those pieces of information to your business are, the least privileged like that should be granted to those documents. And that can create, challenges in other ways. But that is certainly the most direct approach to approaching data loss prevention. That all being said, as an attacker, if I have read access to a file and I don't want it to get seen going across the network, I'm just going to encode it in a different encoding that I can read off of the disk and send it away. So definitely encryption is important because, encoding a file into a different form of text is very easy. And some people here might know base 64 encoding, super easy to do. And on top of it, if you block me, then I'll just re-encode it with an extra bit in there. And
so Ryan, my number 2 was going to be behavior analytics.
Yeah, behavioral analysis. Yeah.
And then if you can actually do an IR based off the behavior, like things that flag like, hey, why is this user encoding files into something base 64? That's a behavior that could trigger.
That seems odd.
That would be one. Yeah.
Yeah. Janice, the accountant, I didn't know she knew base 64.
Yeah, exactly.
Part one, trigger the behavior. Part 2, can you respond to it? Like if you even thought, and I think back to Sony, if you remember the Sony attack, huge, right? The attackers set up a peer-to-peer torrent network inside of Sony, right? Like that could have flagged. Like, hey, why is some user setting up a torrent network inside of our network? And then why are they sending gigabytes of data out to torrent? That could have been a flag, but then you have to have the ability to actually go investigate.
Yeah.
Terabytes. Like that would have been a spike. If someone was monitoring network traffic, they definitely would have seen a spike of, gigabytes or terabytes of data leaving the network.
Yeah. But this one's really important, not only because, money's important and it's the lifeblood of most organizations, but this one just seems to be like really tough. So I'm curious, you guys, all 3 of you have sat on the customer side of this world and CISO world, all that kind of stuff. What are some best practices around budget specifically for this?
Yeah, so the typical, what you see for averages for like an IT budget, right, is between 4 and 7%, generally speaking. And then one of the core issues is that usually the cyber security budget is a subset of the IT budget. And that's one of the main challenges because you're directly putting form and function against security, right? That do you go out and do you buy a bunch of servers, or do you go out and do you buy some security equipment or
competing priorities?
Right, you have competing priorities in that regard. And the cyber, I would say the rule of thumb is somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 14% of the IT budget goes towards cybersecurity. So it's not even really half. And that's I think that's one of the major challenges that you have when you're talking to people that have to use these budgets and create these budgets and go and sell these budgets. It's easy to say, oh, well, we need 20, 40 servers to go and scale X, Y, and production on X, Y, and Z application, whatever. That's the people that have the money go, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But it's difficult for them to turn around and, like I was saying earlier, go and say, hey, well, I need to go and spend X, Y, and Z for vulnerability management, and I need new firewalls because our old ones don't cut it anymore. And there's a new next gen antivirus that deals with all the latest threats, and I need micro segmentation, and we should probably start looking at containerization because that's and right. So and all that's got to come out of one little piece out of another little piece of a budget. This becomes a very difficult thing to try to sell to your CFO or CEO, whoever owns the purse strings. But I think there's a way, and you know, and I've used this in the past, that has been able to kind of work around that and be able to get cyber budget that's outside of really the IT budget. And we normally go after some of the budget that they put into the risk category. So their risk mitigation and their risk portfolio. So we'll normally, you know, start classifying some of the cyber budget not only as an IT expense, you know, because you still need you know, generally speaking, still need firewalls and those kinds of things, but you can specifically start talking about risk and how much risk you are mitigating, and that can be tied to dollar figures. And you do that with really quantitative budget analysis, and you're looking at what risks are out there and not the likelihood of them. That's qualitative. You know, how much will they cost and how likely is it to happen? That's kind of what everybody, you know, in the cyber world has been using since, you know, the beginning of time, but really going more into the qualitative analysis, and Dan's really an expert on more of the qualitative, how that happens. So I'll let him talk about that a little bit more, but it is it's really a shift in how you think about how much you should be spending in cyber to mitigate risk.
Yeah, Joe. So you're right. Quantitative, qualitative. It's something that we hear these terms tossed around a lot, and people kind of get them mixed up. And I tend to focus on quantitative because I'm a math guy. I want to see the numbers, and it helps me when I'm trying to convince, you know, like other executives, like, you know, the VP of finance. If I'm trying to convince other executives about why the security budget should be higher, it's usually easier for me when I do the math and I show them. It's very much like insurance calculations when they're trying to calculate, you know, how often does a flood happen, and then if we flood, what kind of damage are we going to take? You know, or like the cost to recover from a flood. It's very similar. And so when you take all that same kind of mentality of trying to plan ahead for disaster recovery, all of that can be applied also to cybersecurity. You know, for example, think of a ransomware attack. If the ransomware attack takes the whole company offline and maybe it takes you a month to recover, now you can calculate your loss of revenue for a month. You know, just very simple. And I know there are things that are more complicated than that. But if your annual loss expectancy could be 30 days and your annual rate of occurrence, maybe that only happens once a year or once every 3 years or once every 5 years, it's exactly like a flood, you know, trying to calculate flood damage. So when you base your security budget on the math with this quantitative analysis, it's much easier to get the executive buy-in, right? Like when you're talking to other people that are not security experts, you know, like us, or they don't have a security partner like Blue Team Alpha. Now it's a lot easier for them to understand the risk that they have. Like if we go offline for 30 days, that's going to be a significant hit to our revenue. And you don't want to spend more than the loss, you know, because that wouldn't make financial sense if you tried to tell the CEO like, oh, I need $1 million for security to prevent a $500,000 loss. You know, then that, of course, that's not going to get approved. But if you came in under the expected loss to say, well, I think if I had a budget of $100,000, I could prevent $500,000 in damages every year. That's pretty much a green light.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's usually, you know, they're gonna insure probably up to that top line amount, and give a percentage basis of that risk to mitigate it. So, you know, so they'll give up, you know, commonly 10 to 20%, something like that, to mitigate the risk, and then they'll insure anything that's above that. That's, you know, that's what I've at least experienced when working with CFOs and CEOs on more of this type of a budget and risk calculation.
Yeah.
Ryan, what about
What have you seen?
What have you seen?
Me?
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk about it from a quantitative perspective. I think I think a lot of times people who have to deal with security budgets and they have to deal with trying to get money for their department, and I've had, early on, if you start talking in this way of these risks, and you give this outsized, like, oh, I mean, you do the calculation and you're like, oh God, like this is how much money we could lose every time. If you're looking at it from a risk perspective, you'd amortize that across the incidence rate. And
Right.
and if they look at the situation and you say like, hey, well, it hasn't happened yet. So, I mean, we've been operating for 5 years. There is a way to address this. In statistics, it's called the rule of three. If you look it up, it allows you to predict with 0.95 confidence ratio. If an event has not occurred in a certain amount of samples, it will tell you the likelihood of that event not occurring with a 95%. It'll give you the incidence rate. It's really interesting. I've been able to use it to effectively argue for budget, because I was able to show how amortized across the time delta, that it was actually cheaper on a cost basis. It's like the same thing you do with drive failure rate, right? You're showing how, like, hey, it's actually cheaper to go with this than to live with that risk, because that risk is divided across the amount of time. And unless you can really convince them, like, here is the rate that is going to happen, then yeah, oh, scary, millions of dollars. But if you don't know how to take it across the incidence rate, it's much harder to convince people, like bean counters, who are really good at it, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
So that'd be my perspective on that. So I've had a lot of success with that in a number of different scenarios, and not just for security budgets. So
a really good report for people that I recommend to use for that kind of data comparison to get good data is from FBI Cybercrime. They have the IC3 report that comes out every year about all the statistics that they've collected from victims, how much money they lost, what type of attack it was, what system was affected. That's, if you need some statistics to pull the data from to do the math, that's the one that I typically recommend. 2023 hasn't come out yet. I just checked it this morning. They only have up until 2022, but 23 should be coming out soon.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for attending today, and thank you, Ryan, Joe, Dan, for sharing your knowledge. But really, really appreciate everybody's time, and yeah, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your leap day.
Happy leap day. Yeah.
Yeah. Happy leap day, everybody.
Yep.
Bye.
Thank you so much.